Ok. Bom, pessoal, sejam bem-vindos à segunda edição do nosso Seminário Internacional de Pesquisa e Comunicação, Esporte e Mídia, uma série de palestras, né, de talks, lectures, com 3 pesquisadores da área, internacionais. Era para ser quatro, né, mas infelizmente nosso primeiro convidado foi difícil, porque a primeira convidada que a gente havia convidado precisou cancelar. Eu convidei o Rafael, então, para cobrir, ele também precisou, infelizmente, cancelar, por problema de saúde. Espero que esteja tudo bem com ele. Mas hoje, então, começamos um pouquinho mais curto. Ano passado foram 4 palestras, dessa vez vão ser 3. Todas elas estão disponíveis no nosso canal do YouTube. Eu vou passar para vocês. E dessa vez é com o professor Dr. Markus Stauff. Eu vou trocar para o inglês, tá? Só porque eu vi que tem até as pessoas nossos convidados também, pessoas em inglês, que falam inglês aqui na audiência. Então, eu vou trocar para o inglês, o professor Markus vai falar em inglês também. Tem a transcrição, eu acho que a transcrição funciona para quem quiser acompanhar, pelo menos para quem lê inglês melhor. Eu acho que dá para habilitar a tradução aqui no Teams. Tá bom, gente? Mas depois a gente consegue também habilitar nas legendas lá no YouTube, quando eu botar no grupo. Eu vou passar também uma lista de presença, isso é importante para principalmente quem é do PPG, da Tuiuti, e também para quem quer o certificado de horas complementares, ok? Vou fazer a apresentação de novo em inglês. So welcome everyone. I'm Professor Márcio Teles, and here with me is Professor Markus Stauff. Welcome to the second edition of research seminar on communication, sports, and media. This is the second year we are organizing this little event. And this is a organization of University Tuiuti do Paraná, from Brazil, Curitiba, in Brazil. And my research group called Mídia, Tecnologia e Cotidiano, with also my other group, not official one, called Comunicação, Esporte e Mídia, Comunicação, Esporte e Mídia. Nice to see all of you, Anderson and other colleagues and students, and Carlos, hello. Nice to see you all. Here, for this first lecture, so it'll be 3 lectures, this Thursdays and the 2 next Thursdays. And for this one, it's a great pleasure to have Professor Markus Stauff. Markus is a friend, and he has a PhD from University of Bochum, Germany, with a thesis on digital television and governmentality. He teaches BA and MA level courses on topics like media aesthetics, media infrastructures, television, digital culture, media sports, datafication at University of Amsterdam in Netherlands. So he will talk with us about image versus data, sports changing media epistemologies. And then after we'll have a little chat, questions with Professor Markus. Just one more thing. There is an attendance list, so everyone, if possible, if you can put your names in the list, I will share here in the chat of the conversation. But I hope you have a very nice talk with Professor Markus Stauff. So thank you very much for being here with us, Markus, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Marcio. It's really nice to be invited to this occasion. It's a pleasure to present my work in this context. My work is still deeply embedded in what I would describe as a Eurocentric context, and so it's all the more important for me to get feedback from different parts of the world, how you would look at the same issues I described from my perspective. So all feedback is welcome. What I want to do today is discuss the role of data and images in sports and how sport actually allows us to understand data and images. And the starting point is just when we experience sports today, it is characterized by wild and ever-changing mix of images and data. Sport often uses innovative technology in the creation and presentation of data and images, and thereby familiarizes a broad audience with such new technologies. Images and data, I would say, are not just an embellishment in sport, but they are used to offer a broad audience detailed accounts of the actual performances of sports. As such, both images and data are an essential part of competitive spectator sport, so the type of sport that actually emerged in the 19th century and that we still experience today. Since images and data offer an ever more detailed account of performance, sport also accentuates and highlights the qualities, the respective qualities of images and data, and makes this very visible. This is what I call, and maybe it's too big a word, the media epistemologies. So I'd argue that in sport, both data and images become part of knowledge practices, and that sport uses and combines images and data because of their respective potentials for knowledge practices. The science historian Peter Gallison has shown for the natural sciences of the past 200 years that they constantly fight about the role and the consequences of data and images. So that's what he says, the sudden, powerful opposition attraction between wanting to know with eyes open, this would be images, and wanting to know with eyes closed, this would be data, has produced some of the most turbulent and generative times in the history of science. These are the moments of iconoclash. So a debate about what is the better way of producing knowledge. Even if, of course, sport surely is not an area of iconoclash, but rather about iconophilia, so the images really are dominant. I think it is interesting to see how this combination of images and data are articulated in sport. So to specify my question for today, what is the epistemic role of images and data in a field that connects the knowledge practices of very different actors and institutions? That is how I would describe sports, and that seems to be dominated by spectacular images. So what am I going to do? I want to shortly introduce this concept and the relevance of knowledge practices in sports. I will then, in the first part, focus on data and explain how data were constitutive for the emergence of sport as we know it today, and what epistemic role data played then. I will then move to images, how images became more and more important for sports, and how their epistemic role was articulated in sports. And then I will wrap up by making a comparison and with a conclusion on the wider social cultural impact of sports use of images and data. First of all, let me really know also while I'm speaking if I'm not comprehensible, either technically or content related. So I will try to have an eye on raised hands or whatever when there are any technical issues. So sports and epistemic practices. Maybe I'm too defensive here. I don't know your take on sports, but I still feel the need that I need to defend that claim that sport is very much dominated by knowledge practices, because very often research on sport focuses on questions of spectacle, on questions of emotions, of affective involvement, on ritual dimensions of sports. And these are all important, but I would say that knowledge practices are a constitutive element of sports, only if we understand that, we can fully understand also the broader cultural and ideological consequences of sports. I was happy to read the very recent publication, Redefining Sports Media. It was actually recommended to me by Carlos Andrea, so I'm happy to have him here. And like other publications on sports media, it really highlights the close, intense entanglement between media and sports. But it highlights what Jason Quito-Lopez calls the epistemic uncertainty of sports. So the specific claim of the book is that the open outcome of games, of competitions in sport, shape all sports-related content. He says that competition, liveness, and realness are aspects of sport that are highlighted through this epistemic uncertainty and that can be harnessed by media to attract an audience. I, however, want to deviate from that a little bit. I want to add something, because I think to fully understand sports knowledge practices, we need to see that sports beyond this open-ending outcome of sports also includes an ongoing evaluation of performances. So this is something that goes beyond just the epistemic uncertainty of the open outcome of the game, but it highlights the ongoing evaluation of games. And secondly, in this process, I think sports actively appropriates, uses, changes, but also displays the qualities of different media. And that's why I suggest to make this small change and write sports media with an apostrophe. So it's really the media of sports, the media as they are created and used and appropriated by sports. To kind of, again, defend this take on sports, I want to shortly, before I go into the historical part, make an argument that the actual experience of fans is really shaped and characterized by such knowledge practices. Not only, of course, the knowledge of the rules of the game, but a detailed knowledge of performances and how they relate to the overall competition defines fans' involvement. A recent ethnographic study by Michael Wetzel shows that fans in the stadium react to situations during the game independent of knowledge that goes beyond that game. So, for example, the specific history this game has with the history of the opponent your own team is playing against, the prior performance of a player, they all shape how much enthusiasm or how much anger is developed at a certain moment. New audience members, Wetzel describes, learn about the game by asking questions about the affective expressions in the stadium and wanting to understand why fans react to a certain situation as they do react. This description of what's happening in the stadium, that affects and emotions are dependent on knowledge of a longer history, is actually in line with a more classical study about sports fans and television. Walter Guntz has shown already in the 1980s that sports fans are fans that really prepare for watching a game. So he says sport fans have a lot of commonalities with fans of soap opera, with fans of sitcoms, but what makes them specific is what he calls the pre-program preparation. So even if this was very short, and as said, maybe a not necessary defensive move from my side, I wanted to use these examples to show that even in the experience of fans, knowledge about the game plays a very decisive role. And this means knowledge beyond the individual game, And this is also where I go beyond this aspect of the epistemic uncertainty of an individual game. This broader argument, this description of the relevance of knowledge beyond a game in sports brings me to the more broader historical perspective. So how did this ongoing evaluation of performances emerge, and what is the role of data in that? Guido Lopez's definition of epistemic uncertainty is mostly defined as a feature of each individual match. But what makes sports organization of competition characteristic and also cultural impactful is how each individual competition is embedded in a broader, more expansive comparison, in a ranking, in evaluations of performances. So what you see, and this is very typical for sports, what you see during one particular competition gets significance in relation to competitions' performances at different spaces and at different times. Think about the difference between a runner winning a 100-meter sprint and the runner achieving a new world record in exactly the same competition. This is the difference between the significance of an event and the significance of a wider comparison. To my mind, this embedding of each individual event in this broader comparison is not sufficiently taken into account in most media sports studies. To outline this historical development, I will mostly use a concept that the sociologist Tobias Veron introduced when he described sport as public comparison of performance. And I want to outline that in more historical detail now. So maybe you all know that throughout the 19th century, especially in England, but also at other places, sport became a very common pastime. People did that, but it was, in the first half of the 19th century, often still just a social occasion. But in the 1860s, sports gets the form of organization that we know today. It is characterized by what I call the embedding. An exciting competition becomes embedded in a broader horizon of comparison. And according to Veron, this embedding is dependent on three different aspects. Their interplay actually create that embedding of individual competitions in a wider comparison of performance. First, media start to report on individual games, and this makes an audience interested in sports beyond the match of their local team they would go to on the weekend. So newspapers have, like you see here on the right, they publish lists of results. Here it's kind of lists of running contests from different places. And the audience might get interested in that. Second, and partly in interrelation with that, the different contests get standardized. At the start of the 19th century, you would have a local running contest, you would have a local football match. But if newspapers report on that and you want to compare the running contest on in one city with a running contest in another city, it makes sense to standardize the running competitions or to standardize matches of football or of baseball, the images you see here, so that they become more easily comparable. The third dynamic is that games, in interrelation with the other two dynamics, become organized in a more systematic and more regular way. So this is what I call a reorganization of competition, and what I will focus on for about 5 minutes, because it shows us the relevance of data, the constitutive relevance of data for sports. So as said, at the start in the 19th century, a lot of competitions were just social occasions, neighbor schools were meeting and were having a contest. The idea was that you can build your character in this competition and so on. With a kind of increasing reports on newspapers, people might get interested in more regular competitions, and newspapers were also publishing lists that were comparing performances from different places, especially at the end of a season. And these lists, at the start, they were just ordered alphabetically, became more and more interesting because there were more competitions happening. And then you would wonder who actually in this list is really the best one, who actually delivered the top performance of all the people who are in the list, all the teams who are in the list. And this is when teams and individuals started to tour, when successful teams kind of traveled around to meet a lot of other teams. And then there were informal championships. If one team was successful beating one team after the other, they were called champions. A second step, however, created the form of competition that we know today. And this resulted from what Veron and Minesian call proto-statistical comparison of large number of games. So when you had a lot of competitions, you were asking who is actually the best. And then you were wondering if a team that played 20 games and lost 2 of them might be better than a team that played 10 games and never lost. So which team is actually better? And this is a kind of a proto-statistical question, which emerges from the number of contests you have and emerges from the possibility to have numbers and compare performances on the basis of that number. And from that question, what actually is the best performance? The organization of leagues and of cup tournaments emerged, because this was an answer to this question of how, or it was not an answer, but it was a parallel development rather, that this question of what is the best performed on average across a year could be organized by building a league. And so we have actually new forms of observing, comparing, and evaluating performances. And Minesian and Veron say these new forms, I quote, encouraged observers to develop a statistical view of the competition that treats all games as equally important and evaluates achievement based on averages rather than individual games. This historical development, where a kind of the proto-statistical comparison of, or the proto-statistical evaluation of achievements creates a new form of organizing competition, is of course very familiar to us today, but still it is good to see how artificial this understanding of achievement actually is, and how important media forms are for understanding this type of competition. So on the one hand, something like a league table allows to solidify this comparison beyond time and space. So if you have a league table, a lot of competitions on in different places and at different times are put together in one overview. And this actually allows you to understand what an average performance is, even if no one would think about the mathematics of averages and so on, but this is more or less what a league table does. So I want to read out the quote here from Veron. We were hardly able to even understand a league competition without a tool like the league table that allows us to scan the past in order to make sport-specific sense of the future. So this is a very typical example of how datafication changes and creates an object. data is used as one particular, if powerful, way of knowing performances. And this gives access to what Thorne and Palmer call the hidden game. Already in the 1980s, they wrote this game about baseball. And there they write, in our drive to identify excellence on the baseball field or off it, we inevitably look to the numbers as a means of encapsulating and comprehending experience. The hidden game is played with statistics, and it could be set by them, but it extends beyond the record books. One enters the game whenever one attempts to evaluate performance, which is possible only through comparison, implied or explicit. So I think two things are remarkable here. One, the hidden game. It is a game that is not directly visible. It is accessible through data and statistics. And the other is, it is a way of constituting the game and of a better understanding of what is actually happening. Though the data trigger a type of organization, like the league, and then they make the performance accessible and comprehensible. This is key to my argument. When data is used to understand performance, this is only a starting point for an ever more detailed evaluation of performances with data. So when you have a datafied performance, a league that gets only understandable through a league table, then this triggers the production of more data. And I will just go through a number of dynamics that trigger this production and spreading of more data. First, since it is possible to condense performance in simple results, simple data, and compare these performances in tables, it is trending towards a global comparison. There's no reason why you should not want to compare performances all over the world when you have that capability of bringing together performances of different places and of different times in a table, in a ranking, and so on. As such, even if what I describe here is mostly developed in historical research on baseball, and baseball, we all know it is an especially data-fied sport, but it became a model for a lot of other sports, both in the way of organizing the competition, so building leagues, then very quickly developed a spread throughout the world, but also in using these data-fied models to understand and compare these type of performances. And importantly, this model in the end, from the end of the 19th century, also developed beyond sports. It became a model for other practices of comparing nation states, comparing performances of nation states, organizing competition. So sport really created a model for this type of data-fied competition. As I said before already, this form of organizing competition creates an explosion of data. This is partly because you want to get ever more detailed insights into what does determine performance. You don't want to only know the end result, but you want to know, when you compare so many different performances, what the performance actually consists of. This is what it's called the hidden facets of the game, or the micro plays of game. And the most famous example is, of course, the scoring sheet of baseball that was kind of noting down not just the result of the game, but was noting down different aspects of the game to get a better grip of what actually, how does a game develop and what contributes to the performance. This very early on allowed, for example, for the distinction between luck and actual performance. We all know it, especially from football, that one team wins, but you might still doubt, and you might use data to prove that actually the team that lost was just unlucky because they actually played better. And this you can do by kind of datafying microplays in sports. And of course, this is an essential part of sport because it is helpful in preparing next games. So if you know how a team played in the past, and not only how often they won, but how they achieved their wins, this allows you, so if you better understand their microplays, it allows you to prepare for the next competition. On top of that, these notations, this identification of microplays, this expanded datafication, is a rich material for media representations. It allows media, especially as long as there was no live transmission of games, to represent more than just the end result of a game, but for example, in baseball, describe the ups and downs, the back and forth of a game. Data also spreads in the 19th century already because the data fulfill a number of different functions. So far, what I have said might have sounded as if there would be, let's say, an ideal type of completely objective, reliable data. But all this data, of course, needs to be produced, and it gets produced because it is not just the organization, the league, for example, that has an interest in the data production, but there are a lot of different motivations behind that. Teams did produce data about their games just for their record books, for their memory culture. In cricket, that was already established at the end of the 18th century. Baseball took it mostly from cricket, and then it was also adapted by other sports. Interestingly, Chadwick, the kind of inventor and popularizer of the score sheet in baseball, he also wanted to use datafication because he thought it was good for morale. So you discipline, you create morality by accounting every single detail. That was also a motivation for creating additional data. And of course, it was used by media because it could create more attention, more controversies about that. And this will return again later in my talk that, of course, there are a lot of moments when commercial interests and epistemic interests converge, when the interest in having more precise insights can at the same time feed also commercial interest, and this is a first important example. Now, to come to a kind of first wrap-up of the question of what kind of epistemologies data introduce to sports. It is characteristic for sports that there are always impure epistemologies. And historians of science would, of course, say the same is true for a scientific use of data. There is never a kind of a pure epistemology, one kind of method that is dogmatically applied. But sport has a number of very characteristic dynamics here. First, the comparison of performance in the 19th century was always done with data and with narratives. So newspapers, of course, only could create interest in a comparison between competitions or a comparison of competitions of different places, because they also told exciting narratives about the players, the teams involved, the cities they were living in, and so on. And so data and narrative always went hand in hand in creating interest and allowing for comparison. But even more characteristic for sports is how public epistemology kind of undermines or complexifies the professional vision. The professional vision is a term by Goodwin, who explains how in different disciplines people are schooled and trained to look at certain aspects and thereby have a clear eye for things. In sport, we have a public epistemology where everybody can evaluate something. So it's not in a lab, it's not in a courtroom, it is at a public place which is there for for a huge audience to watch that. And so from the start, we have conflicts between what we could call institutional epistemologies, that would be the epistemologies of a league. a league defines what is counted during a match and what is the importance of that counting, and vernacular epistemology. So what journalists do, how fans start counting, how they decide what they want to count, and so on. We also have a conflict between the standardization of the counting and kind of new innovative suggestions of what you should count, what you should have data of, and what not. So this is something that is very specific for sport, that we have these ongoing conflicts there. But we have a common denominator of all these different data practices. The one is they all make a claim of finding relevant aspects of performance. And the other is that they all aim to expand the horizon of comparison, so to include more aspects in it and to allow for a wider and more precise comparison. So this was my argument about the historical emergence of sports, how it is connected to data, and how this is also building up a certain data epistemology, a relevance of data in the knowledge practices of sports. When we now look at images as a second, let's say, epistemic tool for sports, it's interesting to see that at the end of the 19th century, there were photographs, then there were some films showing sports events, and this was in a way a late addition to the already established data epistemologies. And of course, new media, visual media, changed the way we look at and we experience sports. Partly, they now highlight the spectacle of individual competitions. They disembed the individual competition again from this comparison of performance. Especially television, of course, is understood as an embodiment of this kind of spectacle of the individual game, of showing us spectacular situations and spectacular achievements of individual athletes. However, the visual representations, and especially TV, also inherit and contribute to the ongoing and expanded evaluation of performance. They do not only add spectacle and embellishment, but new epistemic procedures too. And this is not least the case because visuality always was key to the comparison of performance. So it's not that now suddenly with visual media, this becomes important. First, the data themselves were dependent on questions of visibility. Christopher Phillips, whose book Scouting and Scoring I can really highly recommend, described how early scoring in baseball was made transparent and accountable. So it became clear that none of the scorers could cheat in writing down their notes. So it needed to be itself visible and visually accessible. On top of that, the people who were scoring, so who were noting down what happened during a game, they were trained to have a professional vision. So how they judge particular situations was trained. I just quote a short passage from the book by Phillips. Scorebooks, as early as the 1870s, had instructions for how to notate hits, outs, and runs, and also rules for official scoring. Were not really about how to mark a score sheet. Official scorers needed to learn how to categorize certain actions, distinguishing hits from errors, passed balls from wild pitches, and earned from unearned runs in an acceptable way. So maybe you don't understand all the baseball terms, but the key here is that people are trained to see and to visually identify things. So this from the start made vision and visual representation important in the history of sports. And another example for that is that sports themselves optimized their games for visibility. And the one banal but important example I want to give is actually jersey numbers. At least in the 1910th and 1920th, so long before film and television were regularly presenting sports, jersey numbers became important because they allowed for a better identification of players. This allowed for better scoring. When you have a score sheet and you want to note down things, then it's better when you exactly know who player did something. But they also allowed the audience to better understand tactics and individual achievements. Funnily or interestingly, it is another example for the convergence of epistemic and commercial questions, because the individualization of players made them into stars, made them into newspaper items, but at the same time, it made it more easily to quantify individual behavior. So here we have another example that the commercialization of sport and the datafication go hand in hand. So when visual media became then dominant, especially with television, they were inheriting this relevance of visuality as an important aspect and contribution to understanding the performance of sport. So visual media contribute to a better and expanded comparison, just like data did. And the spectacle of visual media is entangled with knowledge production. To give you, and first of all, to give myself a moment of rest, I want to show you a 4.5 minute video clip. If there's a problem with Teams and the clarity, you can access it through that YouTube link or through that QR code. So you might want to check that. I hope that this video I put together gives us a shared set of materials so that we can discuss what actually visual material is adding to this kind of epistemology of sports.
Look at it again. You can see the amount of work that David Bollerant's done. Look at him. He wants this.
Great body form throughout.
Look at that. Great agility. Well, look at them scrambling behind. He looks so comfortable. Look at that. And what he's done, this is incredible. It was lovely to watch that.
And this is a nice shot from Rios.
That's a great close-up as well. Great overhead shot. A great shot here as well. Great shot looking up into the night sky.
Stand by, videotape, and rotate. The tape is rolling. Less than 5, and 3, 2, 1. Take tape.
And in slow motion, Blanker's pull. Seen in slow motion, life goes on.
You're really not going out with the left hook and the right tonight. Well, I would like to see the videotape if you have it. All right, do we have the videotape? Yes, we do.
Daar is hij hoor. De doel en technologie. Yippie. Wait till you see what happens here, because you can see it appears from this angle of the camera that. So we can see it here from the other position. Here we can see.
Here's the incident again. You can see the hand on the back of the Hungarian, as we see, just off balance.
You can just see there how tight.
En je ziet die wind er ook overheen waaien.
Dick looked very quickly, but man, looking to his left here.
Great to see the difference in the lines there.
Dus even kijken, de analyse.
And you can see the difference between the two Canadian sleds.
We've highlighted, it still is hard to see exactly what happens.
This is a finish line. Can you believe it? What happened if you look at it from a different angle? You can see, one more look.
Put yourself in his boots. What a call to have to make.
The color of the XL100 makes you feel like you're right down here on the field.
The Philips video cassette recorder will do just that. So you need never miss a television program again.
Every single detail. Millions of fans live for the game. This is why we invented the Aquas Quadron technology.
And see real-time player information and stats on top of the game you're watching.
Oh, this is a slide I wanted to delete, but don't worry. So I would say when visual, what I wanted to underline with that video are two things I would like now to take from that video is that when visual media become dominant for the representation of sports, they first partially contribute to the endeavor of better and expanded comparison. Here, that's the slide I want you to show. So these technologies are harnessed for publicly visible and spectacular knowledge production. Thereby, they also spawn and legitimize new media technologies. As with the data epistemologies in sports, sorry, I again missed. So, as with the data epistemologies in sports, it is important to not just look at the media forms, but also at the layered epistemic practices. So, like with data that emerged in the 19th century and helped the emergence of sports, the visual epistemologies are also impure epistemologies. They combine narrative data and images, and they combine public epistemology with professional vision. And I just listed here in the diagram 3 practices, and they are organized in a circle because they impact each other. So we have the professional vision of referees. The action of the referees is represented on television, where a live commentator also has a partly professional trained vision and institutionalized vision, but combines it with vernacular concepts. And these television comments on the referees are watched by fans who might adapt their own vernacular practices, their vernacular epistemologies, for example, by applying forensic fandom, so doing their own research, highlighting, augmenting images, sharing them on social media, and so on. This is a circle because they actually impact each other. The professional vision of the referees needs to be accountable to the other practices. And it is a circle because actually they are, or the relationship between them is constantly transformed through new media. So think about the finish line, I think in 2 weeks you will have Jonathan Finn talking about the finish line, and think about how the finish line shaped this dynamic between these three entities. Then we had slow motion replay. Now we have video assistant referees. So constantly these different constellations of epistemologies are reorganized and brought into different interrelationship. Second, we have also constellations of visual epistemologies, because in sports, video is actually used to improve the performance. So we have video-based performance analysis, where the recording and reviewing of physical movement allows for scrutinizing and improving different aspects of sports, physical skills, decision-taking, team tactics. Some of the footage for this video-based performance analysis is produced with specialized equipment. This is what you see here in this slide. But a lot of this footage for performance analysis is actually taken from television footage. So we have, again, a very mixed epistemology. Even more, in video performance analysis, video-based performance analysis, we have mixed epistemologies because coaches approach it as specialists who identify certain things, but then they need to translate it to players who get a kind of annotated, selected versions of these images. So the key argument here would be that images in sport, on television and beyond, become part of an intense but unstable set of epistemologies. This was a very short part on the visual epistemologies, but I hope that we can come back to the video later. And I will very shortly discuss the epistemologies of data and images and their interrelation. If sport uses both images and data for its endeavor to get an ever more precise and detailed understanding of performance, what is the role of data and images? I started with a reference to Galison and how he described the opposition of data and images in sciences. And this is partly true in sports too. There are situations where only images are praised, for example, because they allow athletes to understand certain situations, while data is not considered to be something you can give an athlete to learn about their performance. So images are considered to be more intuitive, more accessible. However, I think sport is interesting for the way it constantly mixes and undermines the distinct qualities of images and data. Sport, I would argue, creates such a strong and particular epistemological culture that the differences between images and data become evened out. This is the case because, and I hope that is what I could show you with both the historical emergence of data and the later emergence of images, because the professional and the vernacular activities are always mixed. These impure epistemologies necessarily create different combinations of images and data where the respective qualities don't become articulated but become mixed and interrelated. The combination of institutionalized use of data and what I call the institutionalized use of data and images, and what I call the rogue use of data and images, so the non-legitimized, non-institutionalized use of that, also constantly creates new mixes of data and images. Interestingly, the so-called data revolution in sports, which now goes on since about 30 years and is intensified through artificial intelligence now, was originally triggered by fans who did more or believed more in data as a tool to understand performances than did the official institutions. Even more, data and images in sports are what I would call naturally combined, because in sports the tension between the event and its final result always creates a field in which both image and data bridge between, on the one hand, the individual competition with its intense emotions, and on the other hand, the very pure and abstract result, like a 3-to-1. So a 3-to-1 is a result of a 90-minute highly emotional game. And combinations of image and data always enter this tension and can make claims to bridge this. As one example, which I actually developed when I was in Brazil, in Belo Horizonte, is the use of the so-called expected goal metrics. It's a calculation of the probability that a team could have scored considering its actual performance. And so you have here, I don't know if you see my mouse, you have a very concrete game which gives you so many impressions that it's difficult to actually understand what is happening during the game. You have a super abstract result that gives you a clear number that allows for, as we have seen, comparison of performances, but it doesn't seem to be a fair result for what actually happened in the game. And so the combinations of images and data allow for bridging and navigating this tension between the individual exciting competition and the pure and too abstract result. And this is why I would argue that in sport, we have always this mix of image and data, as Gallison described this for latest developments in the sciences. I want to read out this quote. In conclusion, it may be that the most significant development in the laboratory of the last 50 years has been the fusion of pictures and numbers into the production of manipulable image. Controllable digitized images were built by computers from statistics and formed into pictorial renditions of non-visible worlds. Not abstract against the concrete, but rather shifting historical realizations of concrete abstraction or abstract concreteness. This is what I would say do image data combinations now mostly achieve in the epistemic practices of sports. I come to my conclusion, in which I will very shortly think about the broader cultural consequences of these media epistemologies in sports. Overall, I think sport is a field that constantly poses the question of epistemological advantages and privileges. So what is the best way to find out of the performance and to determine performance? With a highly visible use of technology, I would argue sports adds plausibility to technology's claim of epistemic superiority. I made a bit crude diagram here, but I wanted to make it as kind of simple as possible. Sports' publicly visible and seemingly fair competition, together with the publicly visible application of technology to evaluate performances, make sports into a field which allows, as we have seen in the video, to sell new consumer technology. This would be the commercial result of this public application of epistemic technologies. The ideological result is that it promotes a technocratic society by constantly showing us how new innovative technologies, data and images in combined ways are used to create a rational, fair competition. Just a few weeks ago, this case study, the authors are coming here, Hughes and Elkins, was published that makes a similar argument with respect to a specific case of US basketball, when they say the NBA team, the Golden State Warriors, on and off-court innovations, mostly datafication, promote technologies that quantify and control people's bodies, subjectivity and access to space, while more broadly making the Silicon Valley economy legible and appealing to sports fans. So they argue that the public display of the improved evaluation of sports performances through all kinds of new technologies also legitimizes the application of similar technologies for financial gains. And they argue, and that might be, but this is also something to discuss, specific for the US, that this also is an example of how these techniques are used to extract labor from bodies. And in that case of the NBA, it's mostly white managers extracting knowledge of black bodies, even if these bodies are reasonably well paid. I think we could apply this argument, which is a very specific argument that focuses on data, but I think it is applicable to the general way technology is used and is displayed in its use to evaluate performance. So talking about the media epistemologies of sport does in no way aim to distract from a critical take on the commercialism and the ideologies of sports. Rather, I hope it adds another aspect to a critique of sports. The epistemological dynamics that constituted sports in the first place continue to contribute to its cultural ideologies. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Markus. It's great. A lot of questions. It's incredible your work. I am a huge fan of you, of your work. So let's see if we have questions from the audience. Anyone want to pose a question for Markus? Or maybe I should start. So Markus, I was thinking about the role of media and of course this big database that is internet right now. And do you think maybe some kind of historicization of this push towards media and sports certification? Do you think there is some relation with the internet? I was thinking also of what this idea of epistemic fandom. This is something that Henry Jenkins worked too, when he talks about the fans of Survivor and Lost and so on message boards and forums in the internet, and they're talking about the show. And we have this also in the Twitter and of course message boards of specific clubs and athletes. So even YouTube right now, it's a big repository of old games, so you can go back and see, I don't know, Maradona playing and someone Pelé playing, and do a compare and do this kind of comparative analysis of those performances and try to answer this. Was Messi better than Pelé, or Pelé better than Messi, and so. And the media likes this kind of questions. So I was thinking about how do you believe that the practice of defense and how it is related to our actual media college today, and what do you think about it?
Yeah, thank you. That's interesting, and it might help me to clarify two aspects of what I wanted to talk about. The one is that I went so much back into history, not to argue that there is nothing new under the sun, and surely not in sports, but to show how new media get kind of a specific role in sport, and they dramatically change the way we experience sports, but still they also continue a certain dynamic that emerged with sport in the 19th century. And I think the internet, well, the internet is of course a super big word, but we can, or for now, I would suggest to focus on two things, which you actually also both mentioned. On the one hand, the internet just makes data and comparisons more accessible. And there it's interesting, the book I had on my slides, The Hidden Game, which was one of the early books discussing the data revolution in baseball. It was originally published in the 1980s, and they, in the new foreword for the new edition from 2014 or 15, they describe how back then in the 1980s, they needed to manually get their data for their endeavors by reading old newspapers, by trying to reconstruct how older games were actually developing and how much manual work that was. And then they describe how now actually partly fan-created databases online on the internet make that so much easier. So this, for me, exactly shows this. There are continuities in the way a kind of a new medium is used to expand the comparison, to make the comparison more precise, or to find new aspects of performance that you now eventually can determine. But yeah, it is still a revolutionary moment in the way this data becomes accessible. And also what you already mentioned, the internet contributes to a new mix in the way of how data and images is used, because you do not only find more precise data about games, but you also find, as you said, YouTube videos. So you can have all these comparisons. You can make new video edits by comparing Pelé to Messi, to see how they played against different defenders, what their tricks were, how they were passing, how they were dribbling, and so on. So the internet here again allows for new combinations of data and images in this expansion of comparison. The second aspect, and I will be shorter on that, is that the internet also adds a new layer in what I describe as this constellation of epistemologies. So I describe it as, there's a referee, professional vision, there's television, observing the referee, having a live commentator, they have their epistemologies, and then there are the fans. And now, of course, what the fans do becomes suddenly something visible and accessible online. That fans can use television footage, make their own version of the television footage, and share that online, adds yet another element to this constellation of epistemologies, and a constellation that needs to be taken serious, because referees might lose their authority, entire organizations of competitions might lose authority if online data appears, visual evidence appears that questions the referee. So in that sense, I think it really adds another constellation to that epistemology, again with its own specific mix of institutionalized and rogue forms of epistemology.
Yeah, I really like this idea of knowledge practice in sports and the idea of meta-epistemologies. But I was thinking on more practical terms, like how this interfere in the sport, like how it's changed. Of course, it's used to change and to make better performance of the sport, of the teams and the athletes. And there is, I guess I'm thinking about this idea of how the media and the mediation is kind of raised of this idea, because even VAR is clear with that. There's the idea that this is a transparent view from the reality that we can now look because of the technology, and there is no idea of this mediation. The same of all this data analysis, like expected goals. It's like now we know the reality because we have the technology for it, but this kind of erase mediation, right?
Yeah, I wonder again if we put it in historical perspective, and it's really an open question, maybe for all other participants. If we compare what you describe now for virtual reality with what happened in the 19th century with data, how I describe a kind of this proto-statistic take, that kind of having a league table really completely changed the organization of a game. It was not a one-sided causality because sports needed to be organized in a certain way for data to be produced. Production of data then also it gave plausibility to the new form of organizing competition and then also evaluating competition. So it's a clear example that a certain media technology, if we allow for statistics to be also be called a media technology, really completely changed sports. It created a new understanding of sport, a new understanding of achievement. And I wouldn't know if people then actually considered this to be a media technology interfering with the game, or if it was also as something, oh, the data are just showing us what is happening out there. So if there was an awareness for the impact of media, or if there was already this mediation in the sense of, oh yeah, the media are only giving us accounts of what is actually happening in the world. And that is what I think, again, we have a long history in sports, which is not yet so well researched, that would allow us kind of to get better insights into exactly that question that is a much broader question and super relevant beyond sports, that media change reality and constantly then still can pretend that they only represent reality. So they allow for a certain reality and present themselves as representations or giving access to that reality. And in that sense, I wonder if what would then be the completely new dynamic of virtual reality, for example. Yes, it is, of course, more realistic than data, but maybe already data had a similar effect of shaping reality and then pretending it's only a representation of reality.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, great. Questions, people? Let me. Se quiserem fazer pergunta em português, eu posso traduzir para o Markus. So let's see if someone have some question. But yeah, I don't know. There's a lot to think about. When I did my older research on sports television, football and television, and this for me was very clear the moment that replay becomes became part of the transmission of the broadcast, that this changed how the players act in the field. And for me, it's very representative of this is the World Cup final in '74 between Germany and Netherlands. There is, of course, this penalty in the first minute, and and this is so little time in the broadcast because the guy go and picks the ball and makes the goal, and of course, and it's about, I don't know, 10 seconds from the referee point the penalty and he take the shot. And then when the replay becomes something more popular in the broadcast, every penalty is minimum 2 minutes. Nowadays with video assistants is maybe 10 minutes, because there is this idea of the representation of the media taking part of the broadcast, and the players knowing that the referee doesn't have the final word anymore. So for me, it's very clear this change of mediatization.
It is, and again, I really don't want to say nothing changed, but
yeah,
also in the book by Phillips about the scoring and scouting, he describes how already in the 19th century, when kind of they were starting with the score sheets in baseball, people were criticizing players in the late 19th century for playing for the statistics. So players were kind of not playing in a way that is best for their teams, but they were playing in a way so that they have a chance of becoming player of the match or player of the year, because they knew how they can kind of tweak the statistic accounting of the game. And so what you are describing is definitely, and we need to describe all these changes of the game through media technology, but we should not say that television changed sports in this other. Yes, we should describe how television changed sports and what are the logic with that. And I think even what you described would be an example of what I several times described as convergence of more precise accounting and a commercialization of a game. So because processes of media accounting separate things, split things up, it also makes them commercially valuable. And the same is kind of slowing the game down, having players who feel more entitled because they are stars, they are brands and so on. So that all plays into it. But I think we still need to see how this dynamic of accountability and the knowledge practices are a part of that, how they contribute to that, and yes, how they change the game, because sports follows the logic of making performances more transparent.
Of course. We had eyes in hand. Fábio?
Sim. Você vai traduzindo já enquanto eu vou falando, professor?
Pode ser.
Obrigado, Markus, pela sua palestra.
Thank you, Markus, for your lecture.
E parabéns pelo seu trabalho.
And congratulations for your work.
O que você pensa da mudança que houve nos jogos de tênis, com a retirada dos juízes de linha, e agora quem define a bola fora lá é automático. A bola vai fora e a tecnologia que diz, ó, foi fora, então não tem mais dúvida. Então, como fica o esporte com essa questão da dúvida? Não tem mais dúvida, né? Foi dentro, foi fora, a tecnologia já diz, foi fora, acabou. Ficou claro, professor?
Ficou.
Obrigado.
Obrigado, Fábio. So, Markus, Fábio is asking, what do you think about the changes in tennis, the withdrawal of line judges, and now the automatic definition, Hawkeye, of course, technology, and what is he's calling the elimination of doubt. There is no more questions in sports. There is, the ball is in or out. He's asking, what do you think about it?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's interesting. First, I have to admit that I'm not an expert on tennis at all. So I cannot comment on any details, but can maybe comment a little bit from taking into account the wider and similar developments also in other sports. The case of tennis is actually discussed by a number of science and technology scholars, like, for example, Collins and Evans. And they, and this, what I also hear from you, they criticize this as precision fetish. So they say what we want in sports is a clear sense of how decisions are taken. What we don't need in sport is the pretension that things can be decided always super precise. And they call this, in the tradition of science and technology studies, as a black boxing of technology, because this technology, the Hawkeye, works, of course, with probabilities and calculates how probable it was that the ball was in or out. And they criticize that this is not made transparent to the audience. So I think it is a little bit in line with what I described, that they also would criticize that sport presents us technologies as things that don't fail, that have a kind of a clear power of taking the most precise decisions by avoiding human decision taking. And this, Collins and Evans would criticize, gives us a wrong impression of how technology actually works. From my perspective, I would only add to that, that of course, these taking out the human element is also something that has a long tradition in sport. And if you think about the corner flag in football, which is also a technology that takes a decision for us, the ball goes either out through the goal line or it goes out through the sideline. This is what a corner flag does. So it also takes a binary decision and thereby replaces human decision taking. And that, again, I think helps us to see how these kind of technological innovations are not a completely artificial addition to sport, but that they are more or less organic parts of sport. But of course, that doesn't prevent us from criticizing certain uses of such technologies. And I would agree that the Hawkeye tends to kind of present technology as unfailable while it is not.
Yeah, of course. Entendeu, Fábio?
Entendi. Thank you.
More questions? Anyone? We should have some time with Markus. Yeah. O pessoal tá tímido hoje, gente. Vamos fazer perguntas e aproveitar. Okay, Markus. So I guess I'll have another one. So I want you to explain the case of for the audience that case from your paper on French tour, when you talk about this idea that the people try to create their own epistemologies. So I guess this is a nice illustration. This case is a nice illustration that if you could explain for our audience.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. It was a paper I co-wrote with Sal Hagen, a colleague here at Amsterdam University. And what we researched there is exactly what you also mentioned before, referring to Jenkins, this kind of forensic fandom. So how fans become active on social media to make claims that kind of prove either the referees or, and that makes it interesting, television wrong. And we did that research not mostly to understand what fans are doing, but to understand how different media become interconnected in sports. And that relates to what I presented today, that our argument was that sports is one of the moments where social media become more or less an extension of televisual culture. Because first, they follow the temporality of live television events. So you can really see spikes in the use of Twitter and other media following the temporality of controversies on television. Second, social media are used to use old television footage. So again, coming back to this aspect of the repository. So on Twitter, people use footage, archival footage from YouTube, combine it with recent footage from television to make an argument. And that, for us, was also an opportunity to say that there are controversies on social media that are not just controversies about sport and what happened on the field, but there are also controversies about television. So fans are discontent with how television presents sports. And that would maybe be a more optimist reading of what I presented today, because today I focused very much on how sport gives us the idea of a superiority, an epistemic superiority of constantly innovated technology, while sport might also open a field where at least the use of technology in sports can be debated. So there are debates, most notoriously about video assistant referee, but in the case of the Tour de France, what we research, it's about the kind of the finish line detection. So there are debates about how do you use media to take decisions. And in that sense, this paper was really about how sports connects different media and thereby also allows for certain media critique.
Yeah, nice. Very nice. So, Markus, I don't know, there is no other questions. We should have time. I don't know if you want to add something for a discussion.
I'm fine. I'm really happy that I could have that conversation with you.
Yeah, nice.
It's really something we need to keep on going. So to keep that conversation going, because it's always interesting to me to hear these different perspectives.
Yeah, of course. So I guess I have another one, but I just realized I was thinking when I was hearing. I was thinking on Football Manager, like those kind of games, because it's kind of a spreadsheet and it's all about statistics actually. So there is some kind of course, when you talk about this idea of epistemic fandom, there is this kind of leisure activity in doing those statistics and following it and playing with it. So I guess something like that is not. I guess this is also some kind of play of, or even fantasy leagues on sports are also based on those kind of statistics.
Yeah. There is some research, I'm not super familiar with that describes these fantasy sports and these sports manager games as bio-fandom, because it is something where you get a view on athletes as kind of physiological machines, which you need to have knowledge about to be capable of kind of winning in the game. So on the one hand, it could very much relate to the research I was using in my conclusion about how the use of datafication in a basketball team actually very much supports Silicon Valley ideology. I think there are similar arguments that fantasy sports also gives you the idea that you can kind of manage people on the basis of data alone. And in that sense, it might actually be deviating from my overall claim, because fantasy football might be an area where you disconnect from, or where you have the chance to disconnect from the event. So I described that all media use is shaped by that tension between the individual game with all its kind of emotional and very kind of live experience, and the result, the abstraction. Fantasy sports could maybe become a game that only takes one element of sports, that only takes the data fight element, because there are fantasy sports players who kind of never watch a game, who only are interested in the data. And that would kind of be maybe a different development than the one I sketched here.
Nice. Very nice. So, Markus, thank you so much for your time, for your great presentation. I guess we can keep in touch. We have so much in common. It's always nice to hear you. And for everyone, thanks so much for being here. Next Thursday, we will have another lecture with Professor Vijay from India, and she's gonna talk about cricket. Is not a very popular sport here in Brazil, but I guess it's a lot of. We'll keep with this discussion about mediatization in sports, and I believe it's gonna be real nice. So thank you so much. And
thank you. It was a pleasure.
Yeah.
And I try to attend to the coming 2 weeks.
Okay, thank you so much, Markus, and see you soon. So
see you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone.